My self-righteous family tried to take my house and give it to my younger brother, even after they kicked me out for lack of space. I honestly don't care who believes this, it's so outlandish I wouldn't blame anyone for doubting me. I'm not going to argue about it, but it happened. I also don't care if my family sees this. I won't sugarcoat anything, but I won't include details that would identify me to strangers. I'm a single guy in my early 30s, and I have a 29-year-old brother with 4 kids. He had his first at 22, the second a year later, the third 2 years after that, and the fourth just a few months ago. His wife, who I'll call S, and I don't get along. She constantly tries to provoke me with her holier-than-thou attitude, and if I retaliate in any way, she instantly transforms into a self-pitying drama queen. She can cry on cue and put on a convincing performance that earns her sympathy from almost everyone. My parents and brother adore her and couldn't care less about what she's really like, even though they know. She's beautiful, I'll admit, but she's awful, and I'll never warm up to her. She also refuses to get a job, despite having a college degree, and my mother willingly plays full-time babysitter, so they're completely dependent on my brother financially. This also means they live at my parents' house, and with so many people crammed into a 3-bedroom house built in the 60s, privacy is an issue. Growing up, my brother was the obvious golden child. There's only 3 years between us, but he developed a sense of entitlement because I'd get severely punished if I fought back against his pranks. It was clear my parents cared more about him, as he got the lion's share of everything good, unless someone called them out on it, which other family members often did. That's why my parents packed us all up and moved about 150 miles away, so we'd only see them on holidays, since it was a 3-hour drive. My brother physically abused me multiple times, shamelessly hit on my first girlfriend, even causing her to break up with me, and mocked any misfortune I encountered. My parents just told me to grin and bear it whenever I got upset about it. I only received equal treatment when my parents wanted to keep up appearances. I admit, it amused me to see the look on their faces when they had to treat my brother and me equally in front of others, like on birthdays and Christmas. We have some very nosy and gossipy relatives, so my parents tried their best to hide the truth and threatened to take everything away from me if I didn't keep quiet. If anything made my parents happier when I moved out at 18, it was that they no longer had to support me. I didn't even finish high school when I left, but living anywhere was better than living with them. I've had minimal contact with them since leaving, and they didn't even attend my graduation, but I honestly don't care. Since then, I've seen my parents and brother as much as any other family member, usually just on holidays. Early 2020 wasn't kind to me. I lost my job and couldn't renew the lease on my apartment because my roommate also got laid off, and neither of us could afford the rent on unemployment. It was a nice 2-bedroom place I really liked. My roommate moved out early to live with relatives before the lease ended, and I had to sell almost everything I owned because I'd be homeless soon if I didn't downsize drastically. I really shouldn't have been living somewhere so expensive, but I enjoyed the higher standard of living until it stopped being sustainable, and I realized I should have been living somewhere much cheaper so I could save more for a rainy day. But I had a plan. I owned a truck, simply because I've always liked trucks, so I found a used truck camper in decent condition for $1,000 and mounted it on my truck so I could live in it temporarily. It was supposed to be temporary, but I ended up living in it much longer than I anticipated. I'd hoped to park the camper at my parents' house, where my brother and his family still lived, but when I asked my parents if I could stay for a while, they told me they were full and didn't want me there, and that we hadn't gotten along for the past decade. They said they'd only agree to let me park the camper there if I paid them what was basically the cost of renting an apartment in my area, which was way too expensive for me. I was unemployed and trying to stretch my meager unemployment checks until I found a new job. I might as well have rented an apartment for what they were asking. My parents called my camper an eyesore and told me to get lost because we couldn't reach an agreement, and S found the whole situation of me having to live in a camper hilarious. My brother joined in, pointing and laughing at me, calling me a bum. I spent that first night with nowhere to go, sleeping in my truck and camper in a store parking lot. I was terrified someone would try to break in, and I didn't get much sleep that night, to say the least. I had nowhere to go, as my other relatives with houses lived far away, and all my friends lived in apartments, and I really liked my area, so I didn't want to leave. I also had my mail forwarded to a friend's apartment, which was the only way I could receive it at the time. Finding a stable place to park was difficult. I searched for jobs similar to my previous one. I saw a lot during my nomadic camper life, from beggars and drug addicts to people demanding I leave because my camper was an eyesore. One time, someone claiming to be with the HOA told me to move, but I wasn't even parked on a street with houses. When I questioned what HOA they were with, they got aggressive and threatened me. I moved anyway, just to avoid trouble. To have consistent power, I learned to use a long extension cord to plug into wherever I could to charge my camper's battery. This meant I had to sneakily plug the cord into random building exteriors parked on the street. I knew it wasn't right, but I had to keep the battery charged so my fridge would stay cold. I had a small solar charging bag for my phone, but I didn't have anything like a generator, and those are loud and require fuel, so I made do with what I had. After several months of this, I finally landed a new job. I had to move to the next city over to find something outside of retail. I worked retail in college and swore I'd never do it again, but I was close to breaking that vow. I was still on unemployment, but I didn't have a stable place to live, and I didn't want to be jobless when the checks ran out, plus I was bored out of my mind. I didn't have much else to do but read, watch movies on a small portable DVD player, use my phone or laptop, and keep track of places I could park and local public restrooms. I kind of envied Japan for having public bathhouses. We really need those here. When I finally got a new job, I mostly lived in the empty lot behind the warehouse and the old employee parking, as they were so out of the way hardly anyone ever used them. My boss, who owned the company, actually liked the arrangement, as I was available to work anytime, as long as I got enough sleep. He even let me take the camper off my truck and put it in one of the parking spots so I could drive around without towing it. I'm not sure if that was legal, but no one bothered us while I was living back there. I didn't have to deal with many trespassers, though there were a few, but the security guards took care of them. I was practically on call. I'd go into work whenever they needed me, working almost every day. My boss let me run power and water to the camper from the building, and I'd work Sundays for free to pay a small amount for the utilities, as only the cleaning crew and security were in the office that day. Other than that, I usually showered at a friend's apartment or the local gym, as the camper didn't have a shower, just a portable toilet, and I didn't want to fill it up, as emptying it is a nasty chore, so I used other restrooms whenever possible. I had a key to the warehouse and could use the restroom there anytime. I even became good friends with the night security guard, who is now one of my closest friends. The camper was easy enough to heat in the winter with a small electric heater, but summer was rough. The camper had no AC, so I had to buy a used portable AC unit to make it bearable. I racked up a lot of overtime and learned some new practical skills from the other employees. Finally, midway through this year, I got a better position at the company, a supervisor role, and started making considerably more money than in my previous jobs. That's when I decided I wanted a house. The fear of losing my apartment made me realize I needed something more permanent and stable. I looked around near my job and found a 3-bedroom manufactured home on a small lot just 2 miles away, and I actually got it for $10,000 under asking price. I used almost all my savings for the down payment and got approved for a mortgage. I was finally out of the camper. There was enough space behind my house to back the truck in, take the camper off, and store it in the backyard for safekeeping. Once I was fully settled, I foolishly bragged about it on my Facebook. My family saw the post, and that's when all this crap really started. A few weeks later, my parents and brother, along with his family, showed up uninvited at my house. I hadn't even given them my address, so I still don't know how they found out where I lived. None of my friends admitted to it, and no other family had visited me before, so I suspect they followed me from work or something. It wouldn't surprise me. They practically barged in like a horde of rowdy tourists the moment I opened the door and just started making themselves at home. They kept looking around, and S had this creepy smile that she kept flashing at me, the reason for which I only figured out later, which made me angrier than a bull stung by wasps. My parents kept saying how much extra space I now had, too much for someone like me without a wife or kids, which is true for now, but maybe someday I would. And my brother kept saying my house was bigger than their parents and closer to his work. These were all red flags, I knew. Eventually, my brother asked to talk to me privately, and everyone else suddenly left the room, crowding onto the front porch. That's when I realized they'd planned this all along. My brother, who we'll call Dan for convenience, said the house was too big for just me and that I should let him and his family move in since his wife was pregnant with their 4th child and my house was much closer to his work. He pointed out that I already had the camper, so I could just live in that while they lived in the house. I want to point out that Dan didn't mention paying rent even once. Keep in mind, he has a decent job. He even started talking about what changes he'd make and even mentioned a curfew and that I couldn't just come and go as I pleased without prior notice. I would have thought whoever was talking to me was insane if it wasn't my brother, but Dan's always been delusional because our parents treat him like he's the center of the universe. I tried to speak, but he kept cutting me off like I had no say in the matter. There was absolutely no way I was going to rent my house, or any part of it, to him. Maybe to someone else, so I could more easily pay the mortgage, but definitely not to him or his obnoxious wife. I'd seen videos of this kind of thing happening online many times, but I never thought I'd experience it myself because it seemed too ridiculous. But my parents, brother, and S fit the profile of a group of narcissistic, entitled, crazy people. So I grabbed my phone, said I was starting a recording, and just held it up. Dan didn't seem to care or even notice that I was doing this and just sat there, waving his arms around, going on and on about all the reasons why he needed my house, then transitioned from saying these things to acting like it was a done deal and tried to reach out and shake my hand. That's when I finally stood my ground and loudly said, "Absolutely not," loud enough that Dan actually recoiled a bit. I rarely raised my voice at him because I'd get punished by my parents for doing so when we were younger, but this was my house, not theirs. My spine could be as straight as it wanted to be here. I stood up and told him my house wasn't something to be taken and that their idea of me letting him move in wasn't going to happen. I bought this house for myself, and it wasn't my fault he kept having kids and had to continue living with our parents. Dan got as close to me as he could without actually touching me and said I didn't deserve the house and that he needed a better place for his family. I scoffed in his face and said that was complete nonsense since I worked hard to buy this house, and of course I deserved it. Dan started yelling, saying I didn't have a wife or kids and didn't need that much space, so I should just give it to him. I said I wasn't giving him anything and that he hadn't even offered to pay me rent. I'd still be solely responsible for the mortgage if I let him move in and wouldn't even be able to live in my own house. Then Dan told me he shouldn't have to pay rent because his family was the priority and that our parents said I would do this and that I was going to do it. I exclaimed, were their words law? And told Dan they had no right or power to give my house away. That's when my parents and S rushed back in from the front door and surrounded me, trying to pressure me into agreeing. There was a lot of arguing, but to sum it up, from that point on, I lost count of how many times I heard the phrase "do it for Dan." During the argument, I told them all they had no right to interfere in my life or with my house and to get out before I called the police. S screamed the loudest at me, saying she was pregnant again and that I couldn't do this to her. I said I wasn't doing anything to her, she was just presuming she could take whatever she wanted from me like I'd allow it. I had no obligation to do anything for her or her family. Then I called her an entitled bitch who had never shown me any respect, so I didn't care what she thought or how many kids she had. I had no sympathy for her, and she wasn't moving into my house. This enraged her so much that she actually attacked me. She punched me in the face and tried to continue, but my brother pulled her off. She kicked and screamed, demanding he let her go so she could scratch my eyes out. My phone was still recording almost everything, so I held it up and said I was calling the police if they didn't leave immediately. My parents told Dan they were leaving, and then my mother said I had a week to come to my senses. I told her I wasn't coming to my senses and not to come back. Then I told S that my phone recorded everything and that I'd press charges for assault if she ever did anything like that again. She screamed at me, then covered her face with her hands, burst into tears, and stormed out. My mother was the last one out the door, and she said I better do this for Dan and S. I responded that I wouldn't. As I said in the first part, a lot of people would find this unbelievable and long. Yes, I know similar stories are already online, and I've read some myself, but that doesn't mean those posters have a monopoly on this kind of thing happening to them. If anything, I'm surprised this site isn't used more to combat this kind of thing, as these entitled people should be more afraid of being exposed here. Anyway, I wouldn't blame anyone for not believing it. I wouldn't believe it myself if I read it. However, by reading my first post, you'd know how awful my parents are. They are the root of all evil in my life, they spoiled my brother rotten, and they never gave me a real reason why. I'm kind of afraid there isn't a reason. Some people can't explain why they make choices like favoring one child over another, so they just double down on supporting the child they favor, which is what my parents tried to do, and I almost ruined their lives, not legally, but more emotionally. Immediately after kicking my parents, brother, and S out for trying to force me to give my new house to my brother, I posted what happened on my social media for all my family to see. It spread fast, but you won't find it now, as it was taken down not long ago, and I set my profile to private. I posted it because I knew the first thing my family would do when they got home was twist the story and paint me as the bad guy, which I fully expected. But I beat them to it by about an hour, and I had video evidence to back up what I said they did. No, I'm not posting the videos here, so don't ask. Getting ahead of them worked, as I immediately got support from some family members. My parents, brother, and S must have been ready to post their own version, but it was too late, so they didn't even bother trying to lie. My parents, Dan, and S had a few flying monkeys who supported them, but not many. A lot of people knew how entitled they were, so what happened was quickly understood and accepted. One person in particular called me, who I didn't recognize, and ranted at me, saying I was a terrible brother and that I needed to make way for a real family man. I hung up and blocked the number immediately, and it hasn't happened again. A week went by, and my parents showed up on my porch with Dan, just like their previous ultimatum. They rang the doorbell and knocked like crazy until I finally answered. I only opened the door a crack, and they tried to push their way in again, but I'd installed several deadbolts that prevented them, and I even braced my body against the door just in case. My father and brother demanded I let them in, but I said I was recording them and would call the police if they tried to force their way in. My mother calmed them down and then asked me in her fakest voice if I was ready to let my brother move in. I told her and the others to get lost and never come back. My mother put on the crocodile tears and asked why I couldn't do this for Dan, as he was her beloved son. I laughed and bluntly said I didn't love him as a brother since he'd treated me like crap for years, and they'd encouraged him. They were terrible parents, and he was a terrible brother, and then told them to leave or I was calling the police right then and there. They all left surprisingly easily, except for my mother's loud crying and the others glaring at me. It was almost too easy to get them to leave, and I thought the whole thing was over, but I guess I should have taken them more seriously, as they had other foolish plans. That Friday night, I came home to find a moving truck and my brother's van in my driveway. It was Dan and his family, and they were moving stuff in. Dan even waved at me with a punchable grin when I saw him. I was furious and told him and his family to stop, but S smugly told me they were moving in whether I liked it or not, and then said in the fakest voice, tilting her head and pouting, that it was okay because my mom said so and that I should always listen to my mom. Hearing that and seeing her smug face sent me into a rage, and I immediately locked myself in my truck and called the police. When they realized what I was doing, S started banging on my truck window, yelling at me to stop and saying I couldn't do this to her because she and Dan needed the house. She cried and asked why I couldn't do this for Dan. I retorted, "Screw Dan, this is my freaking house, not his." Then she threatened to key the side of my truck if I didn't stop calling the police, which the 911 operator heard, thanks to the window being slightly open. I told S I'd press charges if she damaged my truck, and she wisely backed off after I said that. The police arrived, and Dan and S, along with their kids, had locked themselves inside my house. I told the police what happened and showed them my new driver's license with my current address. Then, as we walked up to my front door, I saw they'd changed the locks. The old lock, along with the drilled-out center, was on the porch, and the drill they used and a whole Harbor Freight drill bit set were right next to it. Could they have been any dumber, leaving the evidence out in the open? I pointed out the broken lock and the drill and gave the police a brief rundown of everything that had happened previously. I guess Dan called our parents sometime after I got home because they showed up while I was talking to the police. My parents immediately started lying, saying I'd agreed to rent the house to my brother and his family. I said that was easily proven a lie, regardless. So Dan and S finally came out of my house with some papers, and they both looked extremely smug, like they'd somehow gotten one over on me. They'd actually drawn up and printed a fake lease agreement, but it had no signature of mine on it. It did have a signature, but it didn't look anything like my handwriting. I don't think any of them had ever actually seen my signature, so that was incredibly stupid of them. I told my parents and Dan that this was blatant fraud and that it would be easily discovered if the police investigated, and I didn't think going to jail would do them any good in court, possibly even costing Dan his job that he used to support his family. I also said that if anything was missing, stolen, or damaged, I'd get a lawyer and sue them, and I'd also call CPS just in case. Dan turned white as a sheet when I said that and looked terrified, but my mother stepped between us and said even more firmly that I should do this for Dan and live in the darn camper so they could finally have a family home. I yelled at her that she could do it for Dan herself and give Dan her own house if she thought it was such a great idea. The police separated my mother and me, and I said I wanted them all out right now or I was pressing charges. I loudly stated that they broke into my house by drilling out the lock on my front door. The lease was obviously fake with a poorly forged signature of mine, and I had video of them assaulting me, which were all felonies, and I could ruin their lives if I wanted to, and I would if they didn't leave. The only reason I hadn't yet was for Dan's kids' sake, so they had one last chance to get out. I think that's when my parents finally realized they couldn't force me to do this for Dan. My mother gave in and said she'd end it, and then she went over to S and spoke to her quietly for a minute, while my father spoke to Dan. S immediately started crying loudly, ripped the fake lease to shreds, and threw it around like confetti, only to be told by one of the officers to pick it up or get a ticket for littering. Both officers at this point had the "I don't get paid enough for this" look on their faces. Dan had to start getting his kids to move their stuff back into the moving truck. The kids were all crying, the oldest crying about not getting his own room anymore. S and Dan gathered the children, trying one last pathetic attempt to guilt-trip me with a sad family scene, them all huddled together in some sort of hug while all facing one direction. I swear I think they rehearsed it. All the kids had the same pleading look with quivering lips. S kept rubbing her pregnant belly, tilting her head and looking like a sad puppy, and my brother just put on the saddest face he could muster and said, "Please don't do this, we need a place to live." But I didn't budge and told them to keep packing. All the kids and S turned up the volume on their crying to the max, and Dan yelled at me, "Are you happy with yourself? You're depriving us of a home because you're too selfish to share and help your family." I finally just started laughing like a maniac and retorted that what he was trying to do was take, not share, and that no amount of crying was going to make me let his family move in because he was no longer my brother, just an entitled jerk who thought he could take whatever he wanted from me, just like when we were kids. Dan started cursing at me until the police told him to calm down or he'd be put in handcuffs whether I wanted to press charges or not. He just glared at me with a look of fear and utter rage, biting his lip. I asked the police if they could stay until my parents, brother, and S were gone, and they said they weren't planning on leaving until things were resolved. Actually, in the next few minutes, more police cars showed up for some reason, turning 2 officers into 4, which gave my parents some extra incentive to hurry. I made Dan give me the keys to the new lock he'd put on my front door, which I changed again the next day, as I didn't know if he had spare copies. He very reluctantly handed over the keys, not directly to me, but by throwing them into a storm drain across the street while telling me to go get them myself. But one of the officers reprimanded him and told him to get them himself. He had to pull up the grate to retrieve the keys and got all dirty doing so. When he got the keys back, he just mumbled something and practically threw them at me. Then I told them all to leave and never come back. My mother said I'd be disowned for this, like that was some sort of threat to me, which I promptly called them out on, and very sarcastically said something along the lines of, "Oh no, that means I won't get to spend holidays with you anymore, where I'm treated like crap every time because Dan's always been your obvious favorite. You treated me terribly when I was growing up, and I wouldn't give Dan an organ if he needed one later, so grin and bear it, just like you always told me to do when I was being abused by all of you. My parents were stunned after I said all that, and the 4 officers were giving them some pretty judgmental looks. I'm telling you, if you want to embarrass awful parents like mine, call them out in front of the police, as they're much less likely to do anything truly stupid. Then my mother just started crying and walked away, my father just stood there looking like he wanted to hit me, and Dan just dejectedly held his children. Oh, and S was throwing a tantrum on my front lawn. They quickly got all their stuff out of my house since it wasn't unpacked yet, so the moving out went fast, but during the process, my mother kept saying it wasn't too late and that I could do this for Dan, trying to offer more and more deals to get me to change my mind. She said Dan could pay me rent if I let them stay, and when that didn't work, she said I could move back in with them and let Dan rent my house so I wouldn't have to live with other people. I told her to shut up and keep moving boxes, as I didn't want Dan or his family anywhere near me. I didn't want his money, and I certainly didn't want to live with him or my parents again. Dealing with my parents after the way they treated me growing up would be like making a deal with the devil. S threw another tantrum after hearing that and threw a box on the ground, then sat down on the ground having a pity party because she didn't want to go back to living with my parents. She just sat there looking angry until everyone was packed, and she didn't even want to get up when it was time to leave. They finally got everything out of the house and into the truck, so before they left, I gave my parents one last piece of my mind about all the crap they put me through growing up, and with 4 police officers present, there wasn't anything they could do but stand there and take it. I laid so much of what they did bare in one go and even pointed out how they wouldn't do so much as let me park my camper at their place when I was homeless and trying to get back on my feet. How they let Dan and S mock me and call me a bum. Well, who's the bum now? They tried to kick me out of my own house so Dan could live there rent-free. Yet, when I needed a place to go, they tried to extort me for more money than I could afford just to park my camper, even though they knew I was unemployed. The police gave even more extremely judgmental looks when I said all this. So I pressed my parents again, asking what I'd done besides being born to deserve such awful treatment. Because when I finally achieved something in my life, they tried to take it away for their favorite child because they'd rather I give everything to Dan and be left with nothing. I bought that house with my own money, and I don't owe them anything, and I won't ask them for anything in the future because I'm clearly just a doormat or an ATM to them. I didn't get any response from them. They just stood there looking like fish out of water. So I kept going on and on, asking how they could possibly think they were such good parents. My father turned red after that, but more from embarrassment this time than anger, and my mother cried and said she was a terrible person. I flatly agreed that she was a terrible person, and they all were, and I bet they'd go to hell for it. They were all bad people, and they knew it, but if I pointed it out privately instead of publicly like this, they'd just get angry at me and still act like I was in the wrong. They'd been in denial for so long that it had become a part of them. My mother buried her face in my father's coat crying, and my father looked more defeated than I'd ever seen him. Dan and his family completely avoided me as they finished putting everything back into the moving truck. I made sure nothing of mine was stolen, not that I had much furniture to take in the first place. I was lucky to even have a couch at that point. They all got back into their vehicles, and S kept glaring at me until my brother finally drove her and the van home. As soon as they were gone, I went online again and posted everything that had happened. This time, my parents were too embarrassed to even try and defend their actions. While the family was somewhat divided before this incident, it was overwhelmingly in my favor now. Almost everyone was on my side after this, and those who weren't were just not taking any sides. No one was listening to my parents anymore, no matter how hard they'd previously tried to say we were doing this for Dan. So their remaining family support was now gone. Many family members I didn't expect to be on my side were, including former flying monkeys, so I guess they'd finally had enough. It was around then that I offered to host half the family at my new house for the next Christmas Eve. My parents were not invited. Surprisingly, I wasn't blocked by my brother and sister-in-law's accounts, and I saw that S had given birth to her 4th child in early November. They were still living with my parents. I'm pretty sure they know I'm watching because S posts passive-aggressive posts every few weeks or so about how there's not enough room at my parents' house, probably to see if she can still guilt-trip me, and I'm sure this annoys my parents to no end, as they have to live with 3 loud, obnoxious kids, a mentally unstable S, my spoiled brother, and a newborn baby, getting no peace. Maybe they can move into the camper in their backyard and let Dan fully take over their house. They can do it for Dan. There was supposed to be more, but this post is already too long, so I'll post part 3 later. Update 2. I was going to keep this to 2 posts, but as I was putting everything together, I realized part 2 was too long, so I split it into part 3. To those commenting in MA about me getting cameras, I will when I can afford it. I just bought a house last year and am still recovering financially, and from what I understand, good cameras require a decent computer to record, and I just have a 3-year-old laptop running Windows 10. Yes, I know about doorbell cameras, and that will be the first kind I get. To those who keep saying I should have just had my brother and sister-in-law arrested, the only reason I didn't was because they are parents, their kids need them, and if Dan got arrested, he'd likely lose his job, and without a job, his family has no income, and S has a baby that's only a month old. None of them needed to go to jail, but you don't need jail to get revenge. The police can help. Yes, but I got my payback without calling the cops. Will I be so merciful in the future? Most likely not, and they know it. I decided to wait until after the new year to make the account and posts in case anything else happened, which it did. As previous readers know, my sister-in-law was making very obvious passive-aggressive posts on social media, especially after S had her fourth child in November, posting the same repetitive nonsense over and over again. She just found slightly different ways to reword it, but she was pretty much constantly repeating how she was tired of living with my parents, how there wasn't enough room, how she needed her own house, etc. I know I sound dismissive, but if you'd been through what I have with these people, you'd be ready to play a sarcastic violin in their faces. They're just that bad. And since I waited until January to make the account, more things happened, just like I figured. I said before that I invited half the family to my house for Christmas Eve, and everyone I invited came, even though it was a long 3 to 4 hour drive for them, but they wanted to support me. They complimented me on how hard I'd worked to own a house on my own and were sorry for everything I'd been through. Someone asked me why I didn't just drive my camper 3 hours back home to them instead of living practically homeless for so long, and I had to sheepishly admit that I really liked living here and that I had the best job opportunities in this area. There weren't many, if any, good jobs in my field back home, and I wanted to make it on my own as much as possible, which they mostly accepted as an answer. We went on to have a pretty good party, the best I'd had in years. Some relatives even brought some great Christmas album CDs, and I have to say, the Ray Charles album my uncle brought was my favorite. He just sings Christmas songs differently. It was a great and happy time, and I felt I could finally forget about the past problems and enjoy the present, but if things stayed that way, I wouldn't be writing this. About 2 hours into the party, you know who showed up? My parents, brother, and S showed up unannounced, trying to act all smiles. They didn't even knock and just walked right in like they belonged there. I turned off the music and immediately told them to leave. They begged to stay and said they brought gifts. Before I had a chance to speak again, one of my uncles stood up and yelled at them, saying they didn't deserve to be in my house or my life after what they tried to do months ago. Several other relatives backed him up. Keep in mind, this is my mother's brother, who used to adore her until he found out what was going on between me and my parents. My grandparents, my mother's parents, even though they're very old, rushed between us and told my parents that it was way too soon for them to try and reconcile with me if they wanted to at all, and that they had never been so disappointed in them as they had been in the past year. They'd been hiding their favoritism towards my brother for so long, but no one was fooled anymore, and they needed to seriously try to actually treat me like their son if they ever wanted to be in my life again. They then turned to Dan and S and told them that they'd seen the repetitive nonsense S kept posting and that they were tired of it and for her to knock it off. My house wasn't going to be their new home. S went back to her usual crying and complaining about how she should be living here and not me, plopping herself down in a chair and whining about how it wasn't fair that I had this house to myself when I didn't have a family and she had 4 kids who needed more space. She just wanted a better place to live and to feel like a real mother. I rather cattily pointed out that she was a terrible mother for making my mother do most of the parenting while she sat around drinking, playing on her phone, or spending Dan's money, and she had the nerve to complain. I even joked that I was surprised her baby wasn't drunk from her breast milk from how much she drank, which I admit was a bit much, as I got some eye rolls for that, and S questioned if I was saying she was a bad mom. I said the proof was in the pudding, and if she wanted to be able to move out of my parents' house one day, she needed to use her college degree to get a job and learn how to save money. My mother was already helping with my brother's kids anyway, so she'd have plenty of time once her baby got a little older. My brother's oldest child, who was 7, ran over and started yelling at me because I was yelling at his mom. He kept telling me his mom said I was a bad person for making her cry and not letting them live here. At this point, my brother grabbed his son to pull him away, but other relatives intervened, and it kind of turned into a family intervention aimed at my sister-in-law and brother. She cried, her newborn cried, her kids cried, heck, even Dan almost cried. He was practically breaking down from the verbal lashing he was getting. He just ended up sitting on the window seat where I kept my shoes by the front door, looking completely defeated. He couldn't look anyone in the eye, and he couldn't even get 2 words out at me because the whole house was full of angry people ready to judge him if he tried to pull his spoiled act again. If they hadn't been there to stop him, I bet it would have been a repeat of what happened months ago when he tried to order me around and take my house. But by this point, he'd completely lost face, and his and my parents' reputation in the family was completely ruined, as all the pretenses were gone. Not long after, my parents, brother, and S left in disgrace, and the party resumed. We all avoided talking about what just happened, and since most of the adults had been drinking, everyone just stayed over at my place. I even let some people sleep in the camper so there was enough room, which I admit was also a nice guest room. My relatives also wanted to see it earlier, and they said they couldn't believe I'd lived in it for about 2 years. I got a lot of questions about it, like what it was like in the summer and winter, etc. I woke up earlier than everyone else and made a fresh pot of coffee on Christmas morning and had some ibuprofen ready for those who had a bit of an eggnog hangover. I got compliments on being a better host than my parents, and we all agreed to do it again next year. After Christmas, S finally stopped making those obvious posts aimed at me and deleted all the old ones. But not long after New Year's, she made a new post complaining about how she tried to convince my parents to buy a camper like mine so it could be put in the backyard for Dan and his family to use the whole house. Well, what's good for the goose is good for the gander is never a fun thing, as my parents flat out refused the idea. I heard no one was kicking them out of their own house, much less their master bedroom. This post only stayed up for a few days before S deleted it, and she's barely posted anything since. She likes to complain, but if a tree falls in the woods and no one is around to hear it, does it still make a sound? I guess S has realized there's no point in complaining when no one is listening, and Dan, on his single income, can't afford to move out of his family's place anytime soon. I wouldn't be surprised if they have more kids in the next few years. Since then, things have been quiet on my end. I've even had friends over for poker night at my place. I'm terrible at poker because I can never remember anything about it, but oh well. We can drink and eat junk food and have fun being idiots. We all got a bunch of Whoppers from Burger King and just had a good time the way 4 grown men just wanting a good time and getting drunk do. I think maybe around the summer, I'll consider dating someone. I'm not getting any younger, after all, and hopefully, everything goes well. My camper is just sitting in my yard now. I admit there have been a few days where I've just gone out there and hung out for a while. I did live in it for 2 years, and it's like my second home. Maybe one day I'll actually use it for camping like it was intended. I've never been camping before. My parents thought it was a waste of time, so it'll be a whole new experience for me. This pretty much marks the end of everything that happened. My parents, brother, and S mostly avoid me. In fact, they seem to have gone back to pretending I don't exist like they did before I bought the house, but that doesn't bother me at all. It's better this way. But they're bound to come back in some way. I know they will. I'm just wondering what kind of foolishness they'll pull next, and if anything else noteworthy happens like this, I'll make another post if this account is still active. New update. Part 3. This won't surprise some who commented on my previous posts, as my parents did do one of the things they said they would do, which was wanting either my money or my signature. I did expect the typical narcissist thing of saying I owed them or giving me some socialist garbage about sharing my wealth, but that was just wishful thinking. What followed was somewhat similar but much tamer. I guess you could say they seemed to know not to push me too hard now, and they were mainly looking for sympathy. It started with my parents recently contacting me through social media, asking to meet at a public place of my choosing, which was practically screaming trap, but I wasn't afraid. In fact, I found it amusing. They knew I wasn't someone they could just walk all over anymore, so I could only wonder what they wanted this time. I chose a local restaurant that may or may not have olives and a garden in the name, and we met there. Dan was with them, but he mostly kept his mouth shut. We exchanged awkward greetings, ordered some drinks, and then got down to business. My parents begged me to help Dan get his own apartment so he could finally move out. Apparently, Dan's credit was shot, and I wondered why that could be. Could it be because his wife constantly spends him into debt? They asked me for some money or to co-sign on an apartment and help pay the rent. I simply said no to both. That's when Dan got angry and spoke up. He yelled at me, saying I had so much and didn't have a family to support like he did. He needed my help, and I should spare some money for his family since I didn't have one myself. I laughed and asked where they were when I needed help. Oh, right, they were pointing and laughing at me for being homeless. Or should we go further back to my childhood, which I'd gladly delve into in front of a large audience. My mother grabbed my hand at that point, begging me not to talk about any of that, and my father and Dan just looked away and said nothing. I'm pretty sure they wanted to say things like they used to say to me, but they refrained. I asked them if they thought I was rich, and their expressions said it all. They looked at me like deer in headlights when I told them I didn't have that kind of money. I went into detail about how much I managed to save for the down payment on the house and how I had to live and work to save that much so quickly, and then I spent almost all of it on the down payment, and I was still recovering financially. I did have some disposable income each month, yes, but most of it went straight into my savings. I asked Dan what his yearly salary was, and when he told me, I pointed out that it was actually slightly higher than mine. Then, right in front of my parents, I did some rough math and roughly broke down how about 70% of my income went towards my mortgage, insurance, gas, internet, phone, food, and other bills, leaving at most 30% to put into savings, which I needed to rebuild my finances, and I had to make sure I had savings for a rainy day. My truck is from the 90s, and if it breaks down, I need money to fix it or replace it, along with other things that require an emergency fund, like house repairs, doctors, taxes, lawyers, or anything you need quick cash for. So as you can see, I simply couldn't spare any money for Dan, and I refused to co-sign on anything, as that would make me responsible for any bills Dan couldn't or wouldn't pay. Then I pointed out that this was probably why my parents didn't co-sign on an apartment for Dan a long time ago. My mother started crying again. I was pretty much one step ahead of them on all of this. I wasn't an ATM or a fool, and I told them that to their faces. I expected my father to get angry at me as usual. The man has thrown a fit his whole life whenever I slightly disagreed with him or my brother, but he didn't this time. There wasn't even a hint of anger on his face. I could only describe his expression as regret and defeat, maybe regret for being a bad father, maybe regret that he couldn't bully me anymore, who knows. Either way, my parents couldn't really argue with me, and I wasn't giving them any money. Dan just got up and said this was a waste of their time and that he was leaving. My mother started apologizing for him, but Dan left anyway. Then, in a moment of goodwill, I offered to treat them to a round of endless soup and salad since we hadn't ordered anything besides drinks yet. I guess they couldn't turn down free food, so they stayed. I deliberately talked about anything but money, and Dan just stayed quiet, either eating or looking at his phone, but my parents just made awkward small talk with me. They mentioned they'd recently joined a local Christian church and that they'd been going for 2 weeks. I said that was good for them, and they, of course, started trying to pitch me on going too. I just said no thanks, and they wisely didn't push it. After we finished eating, Dan left a $10 tip on the table and walked out without saying a word. My mother just made excuses for his behavior, and then we all went our separate ways. That was pretty much it. Not as much drama as I expected, but it was still much better than any previous interaction I'd had with my parents and brother. As for S, while she often complains about my parents online, she doesn't seem to like the fact that she's no longer the queen bee of their household, and I think her toxicity is finally starting to get to them. Otherwise, why would they be so desperate to crawl back to me? S actually suggested my parents move into a camper like mine so they could have the house, which she gets shot down for every time she suggests it. She does seem to have a following of equally narrow-minded people, as I occasionally get messages from people I don't know who are dead set on ranting at me for not giving the house to S. I don't even bother arguing with these people anymore. I just block them and move on with my life, but one very persistent internet troll got a hold of my phone number, and they kept calling me from different numbers. Yes, it seems to be the same person, and they call to tell me I need to make way for a real family man like Dan, but I don't care. The calls seem to have died down, if not stopped completely, as I've made it clear to that person that they're just amusing me by doing so. The last time they called was around the beginning of the month, and there's been nothing since. Update 4. I figured I should update everyone around 6 months after my initial posts, but it ended up being longer than that. Yes, things did get bad again, but not really for me. I've mostly been doing well, if not completely unscathed. Since last Christmas, besides my parents and Dan coming to me for money like my last post said and a recent confrontation I had with S, which you'll read about here. I did get some cameras for my house, including a Ring doorbell on the front. I haven't told my family about the cameras just in case, but so far, no one has tried to break in. I think the way I scared them before has kept them away for the most part. I started renting out the 2 spare rooms in my house, one to a good friend and the other to a friend of that good friend. They're both great tenants. They know to keep it down and mostly stay out of my way and even have small refrigerators in their rooms so they don't need to keep drinks in the main fridge. I gave them such a good deal on rent they couldn't refuse, and this has increased my monthly income. Even after taxes, I still manage to put a decent amount in the bank each month, as the rent covers most of my monthly mortgage. You're all probably wondering how my parents, brother, and S took to me renting out those rooms. Not well. My father and Dan didn't get involved, but S freaked out, which caused my mother to come crying to me, asking how I could rent those rooms when they could have gone to Dan and his family. We had an argument, and I pointed out that, first of all, they broke into my house before, trying to steal it, and she wouldn't want people who did that living with her, and there wouldn't be enough room in my house for me, Dan, and his whole family anyway. There was no way I wanted to live under the same roof as him. It's a 3-bedroom manufactured home. I have the master bedroom and an attached bathroom, which would only leave 2 small rooms for Dan, S, and 4 kids, not to mention they'd be in my hair all the time, and she knew very well I couldn't stand S, as she deliberately antagonized me, and they all laughed at me when I was homeless. Also, my current tenants are both single guys in their 30s, and I get along with them great. My mother made some whimpering excuses, but she eventually gave up and admitted she was just desperate. Edit, the parents found out about me renting the rooms because S basically stalked me somehow, then she told my parents, then my parents contacted me, then my mother came over to cry. Since then, my parents haven't bothered me about the house, so I'm doing good. My parents and Dan, not so much. It turns out S is much worse than I originally thought. I already knew she was a gaslighter, a self-victimizer, and a drama queen, but she got worse because Dan's youngest child turned out not to be his. Yes, you all read that right. S had an affair. In hindsight, it wasn't that surprising, and some people here fully expected it months ago. After she was caught, S was kicked out of the house, and Dan recently finalized the divorce, which actually worked out in his favor, as we thankfully live in a no-fault state. Dan also filed to have his name removed from the youngest child's birth certificate and won. Basically, things went to hell in their household after my parents tried to force me to give up my house. S blamed me for a lot of it. She somehow thought I had a lot of money, like I'd won the lottery, and that I should share the wealth. Apparently, it was her idea for them to come to my Christmas party, as she hoped they could all manage to get on my good side. It was also her idea for my parents and Dan to try and get money from me for an apartment, so when Dan and my parents told her how my finances actually were, her whole plan backfired spectacularly. She had Dan and my parents completely under her toxic spell for so long and fed their narcissism with her own, so she blamed me for them blaming me until what happened with the police when they tried to steal my house. That's when S really started going downhill. My parents and Dan were apprehensive about showing up to my Christmas party after I exposed them, but S convinced them to just throw together some cheap gifts they could get at the last minute and just show up since he'd never turn us away once we were there. Boy, was she wrong. The plan she thought was the smartest thing to do backfired spectacularly in her face with the full blessing of everyone I invited, and I guess getting called out by the family at my party not only further damaged my parents' reputation, it actually started to wake them up to finally stop listening to S. As I said in my previous post, my parents decided to go back to church, maybe because of what I said last year about them possibly going to hell for their actions. I can't say that's the real reason, but you'd feel a little satisfied if it was. My parents hadn't been to church in 2 decades before going back. While I don't think them going to church is a bad idea, they need to understand that going to church doesn't give them a clean slate for all the bad things they've done in the past, but I kind of believe they're at least trying because my parents came to my house in person without Dan to apologize after watching an animated video about my first 3 posts. They'd known about this Reddit account for a long time, and they knew about everything I said. Yes, they weren't happy about it, but I think everyone here deserves an update, as this is anonymous for my parents and Dan. However, watching an animated video about themselves and their own actions was a good way for them to see what they actually looked like. They came over to apologize afterward. I'd never seen my father apologize to anyone like that, and the man isn't a good actor, so it felt sincere. They fully acknowledged what they did to me and that there were no excuses for any of it. They even described themselves as narcissists and admitted they did me very wrong. Then they proceeded to blame a lot of it on S. Yes, they kind of threw her under the bus, but she wasn't innocent of everything they said. My parents have been in counseling for a while and did offer family counseling, but I declined, as I'm not ready for that anytime soon. Dan himself didn't apologize to me for a while, but he's been very remorseful every time he's mentioned the past. Meanwhile, Dan and S's marriage completely fell apart. It wasn't a collapse, it was a series of collapses. Without me as a scapegoat/ATM to mock or try and get money from, and after the public shaming on social media, my Reddit posts, and the online animated video, S finally unleashed enough toxicity on Dan and my parents for them to realize she wasn't who they thought she was. Their denial was strong, but S's entitlement was stronger. I've had many thoughts of lightsaber duels in this whole saga, with S dressed as a flamboyant Sith with a giant lipstick or something as a lightsaber. I guess there are a lot of puns and jokes to be made there, but I'm really too lazy to think of any more details, but you get the picture. Things only got worse as S kept finding other ways to get what she wanted. She kept bringing up ads for used campers and RVs, trying to get my parents to buy one to live in so they could have the main house, no matter how many times they told her to stop. She even tried to say my parents should just buy an RV and live the on-the-road life like normal elderly people. That was even stupid for S. My parents suggested the opposite, for Dan and S to buy their own camper to live in. S basically said she shouldn't have to do that because she's a mom, practically throwing in everyone's faces how she had complete parental authority over everyone because the kids in the house were hers. When S didn't get her way, she actually took her baby and left the house, disappearing for a few days. They knew she was okay because her phone was still working, and she replied to texts with short but passive-aggressive answers. When she came back, she was just more resentful because no one caved to her demands while she was gone. S also refused to go to church, but Dan went with my parents and took his kids, except for the youngest, as S refused to let him take the baby anywhere. Personally, I don't go to church. I believe in God and all that stuff, but I just don't like church, and it's never done anything for me, not since I was a kid. Update 5, Part 2, just to clarify, a lot of this information came from Dan and my parents, so I'm just relaying what I know. Things really went to crap when Dan suddenly pointed out that his wife was a cheater, which shocked all of us, as we thought he was completely under her thumb, but he wasn't, at least not anymore. You all know how he treated me when I was on his bad side. His wife was not spared at all. After he finally woke up, he started piecing together all the signs of her cheating and secretly had DNA testing done on all his children. 3 of the children were his, but the youngest, still a baby, was not. Outwardly, both Dan and I have dark, straight hair, almost black, and so do our parents. S also has straight and fairly dark hair. But the baby has lighter and somewhat curly hair. At first, Dan just assumed it was because the baby was young. Sil just brushed it off, saying it would darken with time. But the baby's hair never darkened. I guess that was Dan's biggest clue. He confronted his wife with the DNA results in front of our parents, and she broke down crying, saying it had to be a mistake. Sil pulled out all the stops with denial, trickle-truthing, and gaslighting, etc., but Dan wasn't having any of it, and he actually put in more effort than I originally thought he would to find out about her affair. I knew he was smart, he was just playing dumb. He had detailed proof of her infidelity, including phone records, texts from her phone, bank account records, and the DNA test. He even found out who she was having an affair with, who was most likely the father of the baby, as he had lighter and curly hair. The evidence against her was overwhelming. Dan said she wasn't very good at hiding her affair, and once he started looking, he figured everything out with little effort. My parents demanded Sil leave their house immediately. That's when she went completely ballistic, starting with yelling but quickly escalating to physical violence. My mother called the police, and Sil ended up getting arrested. She scratched Dan and my father with her long, fake nails and even injured her oldest son in the scuffle. He got a nasty bruise around his eye and a bloody nose when he tried to stop her and got hit pretty hard by her. Dan was smart enough to have his phone nearby recording when he confronted her, so the police had all the evidence they needed to arrest her and charge her with assault. S's parents had to drive over and bail her out, and then they came back to get the baby's things, her belongings, and her car. A few days after Sil got bailed out, she showed up at my house, as I was apparently her next target. The moment I opened the door, she started ranting incoherently, saying I was the one who posted on Reddit and that I was the damn bane of her existence. I'm not sure, but I think she might have been on something, as she was acting extra crazy this time, and her eyes weren't right. She proclaimed that mothers with young children were the most sacred people in the world and then went on to rant about how giving up my house was nothing and that it was the least I could do to support a family and that her family wouldn't have been broken up if I'd done so. While she was going on and on, she actually tried to push me and put her hand over my mouth, and she even got into a stance like she was going to claw me. Well, that went over about as well as you'd expect. I'm not one to be threatened, and I told her if she didn't take her hands off me right now, I was calling the police. I also told her my doorbell camera was recording everything. She started panicking as soon as she heard the word camera. Then I started verbally tearing into her until she backed off my porch. I told her she had some nerve calling me entitled when she was the entitled one. She didn't work, she cheated on her husband and got pregnant by her affair partner, had my mother do most of the childcare, spent all of Dan's money, put them in financial trouble, and thought she had a right to my house and even tried to take it. I said she was the epitome of entitlement, a greedy person blinded by narcissism. Then I told her not to blame her actions on me and to never show her face at my house again. That pretty much broke Sil. She jumped back in her car and sped off. That was finally the last straw for me. Since she was now separated from Dan, I finally went to the police station and filed charges against her for the harassment and assault from last year and her physically putting her hands on me on my porch. The police took the report, and I also gave copies of the videos to Dan's divorce lawyer. Yes, I did get a restraining order against Sil, and it was quickly approved, as it was clear the woman was unhinged. I haven't seen her post anything about me on social media since, but that's only because she made her profile private. I hope I'm long gone from her rants. Anyway, she's not bothering me anymore. At the time, Sil was still with her affair partner during the divorce. I don't really know much about the guy, but anyone who hooks up with someone's spouse and even has a child with them can't have much of a moral compass. Once the divorce started, Sil admitted that Dan was just beneath her because he couldn't afford the lifestyle she wanted. She actually thought she could be a trophy wife and that she was meant to be with someone rich. Dan said he mocked Amy and made fun of her relentlessly. He said she wasn't even pretty enough to be a trophy wife and mentioned her other shortcomings. Sil was humiliated and ran off like a child since she had to live with her parents. Sil was forced to work at their family business, as Dan wasn't letting her use his bank accounts anymore. She'd maxed out all the credit cards he'd given her before, and she complained about having to work for her parents even though she had a college degree. But I guess they're probably the only people who would hire her since she has a criminal record and a 10-year gap on her resume. I heard from Dan that her parents were very disappointed in her as well, but that's just hearsay. They're probably just as bad as she is. Anyway, once this train wreck of a divorce got started, it just kept getting worse. Sil didn't get much out of it, especially since she cheated, physically harmed her ex-husband and oldest son and assaulted me, along with the fact that Dan had all the evidence he needed to win the case. The only thing she got was shared custody of the 3 children that were Dan's, and she had to pay child support for the baby that wasn't his. I don't know how much she has to pay, but it's probably a lot, and she's now stuck working for her parents. Dan got full custody of his 3 kids and is doing much better now. He's even started dating again, and I've met a few of the women he's dated. They're all nice people, and I'm glad he's finally moved on from that train wreck of a marriage. My parents are doing much better as well. They've been going to church regularly and are still in counseling, both individually and together. They've even apologized to me multiple times, and our relationship is slowly improving. I'm not ready to fully forgive them yet, but I'm getting there. I've even started having them over for dinner occasionally, but I'm taking things slow. I've also met someone myself, and things are going very well. I'm much happier now than I have been in a long time. I'm glad I stood up for myself and didn't let my family walk all over me. I'm also glad I posted about it online, as it helped me get support from other family members and finally put an end to all the drama. I'm not sure if I'll post again, but I wanted to give everyone an update on what happened. Thank you to everyone who supported me and gave me advice. It really helped me get through a difficult time. And so, the story comes to a close. A quick note, unearthing and translating this story was quite the undertaking, like trekking through the Arctic. If you enjoyed it, please consider giving this video a like and sharing it. Your support encourages me to bring you more stories like this. Also, please follow and subscribe to my channel for more content. Thank you.